good picture of, what we're gonna do is do the cross-section of the spinal cord. And it is on page 20 of your book. And, so that's kind of where we're at on that. And also on page 19, there's a really good picture of the cervical area. And then it's kind of got the different horns on it. So, 19 and 20. And then in the rehab specialist book, there's some good pictures on page 219. So if you need any more ideas on just some pictures to understand what we're doing.
What page did you say this is?
Page 19 of the book, and then 219 in the rehab book. Okay. With your spinal cord injuries, that's SCI, remember that the white matter is still motor and sensory fiber tracts, and it's also glia cells. And then the glia cells are the supporting cells in the central nervous system, so it goes all the way around. So your glia cells are kind of on the outside also. And the gray matter is the inside. So when you're looking at the gray matter, this is the gray matter right here. And then this is the white matter. If you're looking at a cross section, and literally on gross anatomy, you will see that. And in this picture on 19, you can see it. The middle part is the gray. This is the cervical area. As you go down, it looks more like this, but we're kind of not looking at that so much today, just where things are located. Okay, so the gray matter is the relay signals between peripheral and brain. So your sensory information comes in, and remember that the gray matter is kind of the brain of the spinal cord. It integrates motor activities, withdrawal reflex, stretch reflex. All your reflex activity happens at the spinal cord level. It doesn't, it goes, pardon?
I can't find this on the blackboard. Yeah, I can't either.
It's under spinal cord anatomy.
It's over there. There's the spinal cord levels and reflexes.
It's not that one. It's the one above that, I think.
The one above that is the cranial nerve.
Yeah, that's it.
It's not down here either. Where's your room?
Well, maybe I didn't open it. Let me look. Go back and look.
Oh, okay.
Did y'all find, anybody find it?
No.
No.
Okay.
The one I'm on is just the spinal cord injury reflex.
Yep, it's not available to you. Come on. Guess I've hit my 20th year. That's all right. Thank you for pointing that out. You'll find it, you might have to get out of it and go back. Sometimes that happens.
Okay, it's all in.
Okay, so your gray matter again is all your reflex activity. They believe that actually walking happens from the spinal cord, and so it's kind of more of a reflexive activity. And if you've ever worked with a head injury patient that doesn't have too much like hemiplegia, and that you can have them, they can't, some of them are completely out of it, but they'll walk for you. It's very interesting to work with that. And then it's also where your voluntary motor activity occurs. Okay, so the spinal cord exits the skull through the foramen magnum up here, right in the middle of that hole, and ends at L1. So it comes down, you don't have any space to do this. The spinal cord comes down and ends at L1. This is L1, here's your vertebrae hanging out. And this is called the conus medullaris. And then you've got all these nerves then that come down and go out at each level on both sides. So this would be L2, this would be L3, this would be L4, this would be L5, and they come straight down in the sheath. There's a sheath that holds them all the way down here. And then this would be L5, and then you have S1. And so this is the cauda equina, which in Latin means horsetail. And so what that means is because your upper motor neuron or your central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, when you get down to an L2 spinal cord injury, they become lower motor neuron. So what's that mean to the muscle tone below the level of injury?
Lucidity.
It's flaccid. So if you have a spinal cord, a lumbar spinal cord patient, L2 and below, or even in the sacral areas, which is, you don't see that much because normally if you have that kind of damage down in the sacral areas, they're going to be dead. They have that much trauma to the pelvis. But you're going to have lower motor neurons. So usually what you see, it's probably your most common spinal cord injuries are up in the cervical area, T8 to T12, and then probably L1, L2, L2, L3, L3, L4. So when you get down below, like if you have an L2 injury, then they're going to be a lower motor neuron. And this is the reason. Does that make sense? These become peripheral nerves as they come off in the cauda equina. So they're peripheral nerve, they're lower motor neuron type injuries after that.
Oh, after L1?
Yeah, L1 is a upper motor neuron injury. So if you have an L1 injury, and we'll talk about what that means. If you have an L1 spinal cord injury, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at complete injuries. Most of your spinal cord injuries are incomplete now, by the way. It's very fun to work with them. They do a lot better than what you would expect. But I'm going to teach you complete injuries. That's how we're going to, so that you'll understand that. But if you have an L1 injury, they're going to be an upper motor neuron injury. So they'll have spasticity in their legs below that level. And basically all their legs, because L1 pretty much, T12 is your hip hiker, so your legs are all L1 and below. And, but if you have an L2 injury, it's going to be flaccid tone. You're going to have a lower motor neuron injury.
So
Okay.
is L1 the only one that does that?
L1 and above, all your thoracic, all your cervical, those are all upper motor neuron. But it's the only lumbar that's upper motor neuron. Lumbar injury. So, any other questions on that? Okay, so, and I think Bill kind of covers this for me, and y'all probably have an understanding of already, but there are 8 cervical nerves and 7 cervical vertebrae. So that means that C1 comes out above the C1 vertebrae. The C1 nerve is above the C1 vertebrae. So all your cervical nerves that are named are above the vertebrae. Then you get down to C7 vertebrae, and the nerve coming out at C7, which is this one, will be a C8. So you have a C8 nerve, and it is below the C7 vertebrae. Then they start rotating down so that your T1 vertebrae, the nerve is below T1. T2 vertebrae, the nerve is below T2. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae, right? But you have 8 cervical nerves. So your cervical nerves are above the vertebrae that they are named for. And you come down to C8, and then your thoracic and lumbar and sacral are all below the vertebrae they are named for. Any questions on that? It's just the way they actually name them, probably more so than there being anything abnormal about that. Okay, so spinal cord cross-section. You have a dorsal horn, which is right here. We're talking about gray matter. This is your dorsal horn. This is your lateral horn. And then this is the ventral horn. Within the gray matter. And the way information comes in is sensory information comes in through the dorsal horn and comes in through into the dorsal horn here and does all it's going to do in here, all the synapses, sends information on up the spinal cord. And if you need a reflex, the ventral horn is more motor. So then that information is going to go out this ventral root and go in response. So this is sensory. Your dorsal root is your sensory information coming in, and your ventral root is your motor information going out. So if it's just a reflex activity, literally you burn your hand on something, you touch the oven, and what do? You immediately draw back before you even think about it, because it's not in your brain yet. That's a spinal cord reaction. So that's how that works. Dorsal horn, dorsal root of the spinal root comes into the dorsal horn and then goes out the ventral root. And that's motor. This is motor. And this is sensory. So this is afferent, right? This is efferent. And that's on both sides. So remember that goes both ways.
Do they cross, or do they just go to the nearest motor neuron?
Do
Like,
they
is that-
cross?
Like that impulse, like say the hot impulse, does it cross all the way across this, I'm saying like, kind of like how the nerves in the brain cross?
Not
over
with a
the-
simple reflex, it doesn't.
Okay, so it would just go to the nearest.
Yeah, it will just go on this side
Okay.
and give that information, your reflex activity. Literally, a reflex is a very simple response. It comes in and then you get your response. There's not much synapse there. It's pretty fast because it has to be so fast. So with the reflex, that's the way it is. Yeah. Okay, so your dorsal horn is your sensory input neurons. Your lateral horn is the sympathetic neurons, T1 to L2, that's where my correction needs to be. And then your ventral horn is your motor synapses for your skeletal muscles, where you actually get response. So that's your front part of it.
Can you say what lateral was again?
It's your preganglionic sympathetic neurons, because remember they're right there next to the spinal cord and go out and do their sensory sympathetic stuff. Okay, so remember that your white matter, which is outside of the gray matter, is your nerve tracts. And so this is traveling information. So it's literally, it goes out into the white matter and that tract can go up to the brain, or it can be the sensory tracts that go up to the brain, or the motor tracts that come down from the brain. And so we're going to separate those two out. Propriospinal tracts are tracts right next to the gray matter. And they go all the way around the gray matter. And they are called propriospinal. And what they do is they connect sensory information for 2 or 3 levels. 2 to 3 cord segments. So propriospinal tracts, and they connect 2 to 3 segments for sensory. And the reason how this affects your spinal cord patient is normally if they're a T1 spinal cord injury, and that's where the damage is at T1, then they'll have sensations sometimes down to T2 and T3, because those are connections through the propriospinal tracts.
When you say segments, what do you mean?
Spinal cord levels.
Okay.
So, like if you're a T1 spinal cord injury, you will have sensation down to a T3 spinal cord injury. which will just be, we're gonna talk about, sensory dermatomes. So it would be down 2 dermatomes to T3, and maybe to T4. But when you test the sensation on a spinal cord patient, it's not always just to that level, and that's the reason. Because these tracts connect the 2 or 3 levels. They're called propriospinal tracts, and they're right around the gray matter. Okay, let me say something for you to think this through, because you need to kind of get this concept. Wherever the level is, if they are a C7 spinal cord injury, they're going to have all the C7 muscles and above. So if that, whatever level they have that level of sensation and that level of motor and everything above. Everything below that, they've lost sensation, they've lost all their motor function below that level. If they're a T1 spinal cord patient, they have all the T1 muscles and all the T1 sensation and above, everything above that. This girl's like a T8 or T10. I don't know what she was, she didn't say. So she has all the sensation and basically she has all her upper extremities, because that goes through C8, T1. And then she's got her thoracic rib muscles, intercostals, for her lungs down to, let's say she's a T10. She has no stomach muscle. She talked about needing an abdominal binder to keep her blood pressure up. And she has no sensation or motor function at all in her legs. She moved pretty well, didn't she? It's amazing. And she's kind of threw that leg up, and what I noticed is she really did not balance real well. You know, she was having to use her hands, and so you'll pick up on that as you get around them. Does that make sense to y'all? So like we're going to learn all the C7 muscles. The C7 muscle, the only one there is triceps. So if they're a C7 quadriplegic, they have triceps and everything above that. C6 is your biceps and your brachioradialis, and so we're going to learn all those. But all below they don't have. So if you don't kind of think that through, and then if you have any questions, we can do it as we go through this. Okay, so we're first going to learn the motor tracks. So we have motor side and sensory side. So we're just doing the motor on this side, but be aware that all these are right here too, okay? We're putting all the motor on one side and all the sensory on the other side, but they're on both sides, okay? So our first is the lateral corticospinal. That's this one. So what's that tell me, corticospinal?
Cerebral cortex.
Cortex
Spine.
to the spine. So those are motor. And those are pretty important, cortex of the spinal cord. And then we're going to look at some others that I'm going to just put in here. We've got right underneath that is the rubrospinal. Rubrospinal. And basically this goes to your red nucleus, I believe. Then you have reticulospinal. So if you were thinking reticula, what do you think that's to? Possibly the reticular formation. These are all motor. These are all motor, because we're doing it on the motor side. Then you've got the olivospinal. And then you have the vestibulospinal. If you were going to guess, what would you think the vestibulo would represent?
Balance.
Yeah, your vestibular system in your ear. So that's actually what that is. That's just some motor responses. So it's coming from the vestibular system in your ear into the spinal cord and responding to some different things. These are all pretty much the rubrospinal, reticulospinal, olivospinal, and vestibulospinal are all brainstem information going out. The one I really want you to memorize is lateral corticospinal. And then you're gonna have the ventral corticospinal. So your ventral corticospinal is kind of down here in the front. It's here. So you have two sets of corticospinal tracts. So this is just what you think of as skeletal muscle response. On your corticospinal tract. So they're the biggest ones, really. Okay, so now we're going to go on to sensory. These are your long sensory tracts. This is the fasciculus. And what's a fasciculus? Here we are, those group of nerve tracts, right? Fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. And what these do is they are responsible for proprioception, vibration, and light touch. So these two are proprioception, vibration, and light touch. So let me tell you what happens with these guys. When I was in New Mexico, I dealt with, there's a lot of gang violence there, and Roswell, before I left there, was the murder capital of the United States. We had 17 young people below the age of 19 that were killed in 1 year. And it was just crazy, but I worked with a young guy who had been stabbed in the back. And what it affected is it cut him here in the proprioceptive, in the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus in the back part of the spinal cord, because they stabbed him that way. And he could not, he had motor function, but he had no proprioception. So he was his legs were very out of control. So he ended up having to walk with assistive devices because he couldn't feel his feet at all under him. So that's why that's where that travels. If there's damage on the back part of the spinal cord, then this is what they lose: proprioception, vibration, light touch. Okay?
And that goes across both of those?
Yeah, you'll have it on both sides. Yes, it's both of them. I'm not going to separate those out. It's kind of layered, but just know that those fasciculus cuneatus and gracilis is the proprioception, vibration, and light touch. We could certainly get into more detail, but I'm not going to do that to y'all. So y'all should be thankful. Okay, so then we have the spinal thalamic tracts. And so you have the dorsal spinal thalamic tract right here. Let's go with a different color. Let's do green. Here's the dorsal spinal thalamic tract. And here is the ventral spinal thalamic tract. And what they do is pain, temperature, and deep touch or pressure. So pain, temperature, pressure.
Which one is it on our paper? Because it looks kind of different. I don't want to put it on the wrong one.
I think it's
It
this
won't
one.
matter, just kind of put it there in the front.
Um,
It's the one closest,
right under this is this one?
it's this thing right here. okay? Ventral spinal thalamic tract. So that is pain, temperature, and pressure on both of those. Sometimes pressure is called deep touch because you have light touch in the cuneatus and gracilis, so you'll hear that faint pressure and deep touch as being the same. Okay, so then we have some ventral and dorsal spinal cerebellar tracts. This one. Ventral spinal cerebellar. And then you have a dorsal spinal cerebellar. And that is, it is back. You know what this is, this is my dorsal spinal thalamic tract here at the top, so this is all together. This is lateral and dorsal, and so this is incorrect, sorry. So this would be your pain, temperature, and your deep touch or pressure. And then this one right here is the dorsal spinal cerebellum. You are not going to have to go back and do this. You're not going to have to go back and label them like we did the brain. I just want you to have a pretty good understanding of where they're at. Mainly, I want you to see where these different, the functions are. Where your brain temperature and deep pressure are, where your proprioception, vibration, and light touch. Okay? Something else that I wanted to just talk about are Renshaw cells. They are inside your gray matter, and what they are is they are inhibitory cells. And so remember that you have lots of inhibition, not just things that are exciting. You can have things going in, getting excited, getting all those neurons going, but you also have inhibition cells. So that kind of controls your movement, it kind of controls what goes up to the brain, all of those different things, so that you're not overpowered with too much sensory information. What kids does that happen to? You've got autistic children, that's what's happening to them. Their brain is not working correctly, and maybe not their spinal cord. Their inhibition is not what it needs to be. So they get all this sensory information and it's an overload. So you work with them to try and make them where they can tolerate more sensory information coming in, don't you? Or you try to get them up to a level of sensory information coming in that they can tolerate, so you can work with them. So there's just all kinds of things that you do. Then you have also interneurons, and they're numerous interconnecting neurons in the gray matter, and they're excitatory. So they're also here too. So these are inhibitory, and then the interneurons are excitatory. Just so you're aware of just some of the different things. Okay, so crossovers for tracts. Proprioceptive tracts cross over at the level of the medulla. So that sensory information in the back is going to go up on the side that it's coming in on, so that I know where my hand is out here. It's going to go up on this side and cross over at the medulla like motor information crosses over. And then it's going to go on up into the thalamus, and then to the parietal lobe. If I need to do something with that hand, that motor information is going to come down from the frontal lobe, stay on that side to the medulla, and go across and travel down the spinal cord on that side. that make sense?
It crosses at the medulla?
Yes, but motor fibers cross at the medulla.
Okay.
Spinal thalamic tracts cross over at the level of the spinal cord. And we will go through that a little bit when we start up on Thursday. Because I just kind of want y'all to get this in your brain a little bit. And then again, motor tracts cross over at the level of the medulla. So literally what spinal thalamic information, which is pain, temperature, and deep touch, it comes in on this side and it crosses over at the spinal cord and then it goes up on the opposite side to the brain. The tract goes up to the opposite side. And we will review that a little more, okay? We are gonna have a quiz over this stuff. I think there are 10 questions, so just this PowerPoint.
Is it gonna be on this, or?
You are not gonna have to do any, you need the information, but you're not gonna have to label anything.
Okay, do you have this up where we can fill in?
I don't have it up, but I can get it up.
Okay,
I sent a pretty well filled out diagram of this to the group meeting. I was gonna ask you to look over it. And
Oh, okay.
anything, but it seems to cover everything that you talked about.
Oh, good. Good. Great.
So that's gonna be Thursday.
That's Thursday, yeah. What do y'all have this week?
That's tomorrow and skills check.
I gotta be done with it then.
Are we still doing the bill test on Thursday?
Are we doing what?
No,
You
no,
made
no,
a
no, no.
mistake. You said we don't have to test for a few more weeks. Oh, okay.